Okay, welcome to another Orbiter 2010 video. And in this video, we're going to start learning how to use IMFD. Very excited about that because I have many flights that I think I could improve myself if I could learn how to use this MFD. Now you'll notice here, if you look on the screen, that you can see that I have a sort of a co-pilot with me here today. The other image that you see is Dimitri. I've talked about Dimitri in many of my videos. He's helped me so many times in the last year. So just quickly, Dimitri, if you want to go ahead and introduce yourself and say hi.
Okay, hi everyone, I'm Dimitri. I'm a fellow Orbinat. You may know me as D. Gatsoulis in Orbiter Forum. And I'm here to help David learn about IMFD. And of course, you too.
That's right. So actually, without just a lot of talk, let's just kind of jump right into it. You'll notice that I have here on my screen a configuration file for IMFD. And you'll find this if you go into your Orbiter directory and go into config and scroll down. You'll actually, there are two files, and I want to make just a brief mention of this. You may have imfd.cfg and you'll have imfd5.cfg like I have here. imfd.cfg is actually part of BaseSync, and imfd5.cfg is actually part of the IMFD MFD itself. So this is actually the one you want to look at, is imfd5.cfg. And there's just one thing that we want to kind of mention here. So I'll actually let Dimitri introduce that here, what we want to make sure we change in this file.
Well, because it's going to be necessary to have the date format in IMFD in MJD instead of hours, minutes, seconds, which is GET. It would be better to go ahead and change that entry over here, the date format, and change it to 0, which is MJD.
So basically, just open that file, come down to date format, and you have, this will be set to 1 by default like it is here. Change that to 0. Now for me, I'm just going to leave it like it is because this is a default file that I've got extra. But the one in my config file, I'll show you here. If I double click on this one, you can see that I've already made that change to my date format. It's set to 0. So we just wanted to make that point. It's something you can change inside of IMFD itself, but if you do that, it is not persistent. So every time you start IMFD, you would actually have to go into the configuration of IMFD and change it from GET format to MJD, whereas if you set it in the config file, it will be set that way all the time. So I'm just starting a basic scenario here at KSC, and one of the first things we're going to look at, I think, is just a simple trip out to the moon. Getting to the moon takes a couple days, so the time warps really fast, and it's just a good place to start. So Dimitri, is there really anything that we want to look at while we're on the ground? Do we need to do any planning while we're on the ground?
Well, right now, unless we want to do a direct ascent to the moon, a direct ascent and burn to the moon, there's really not much that we can do right here. It's the same as Transx. We have to figure out when to launch at a 90 heading, and then make enough plane burn to the moon. So for that, we're going to actually need Transx and map MFD.
Okay, can we use can we just use Orbit MFD for that instead, so that people don't have to use Transx? For example, if we bring up Orbit MFD and we've got the line of nodes here, and we can see where the moon's position is.
Yeah, you can also do that. Just make sure, as you have already, that you're looking at it from the equatorial frame.
Okay, so let me just run through what I did just to make sure everybody's on the same page. What we're talking about here is when you go out to the moon, if you follow the DG to moon tutorial, it actually has you launch from Earth when you have the lowest relative inclination between you and the moon. That's not necessary. It's actually a little bit more efficient to do an off-plane transfer. So what you can do is you can bring up Orbit MFD, like I have here, target the moon, and then make sure that the frame is set to equatorial. By default, it'll be ECL, but if you set it to equatorial, then you can see where the moon is at with respect to the line of nodes. And then let's also target the moon on map MFD, and display the lines to orbit plane. And what do we want to look for here?
Okay, maybe it would be better if we bring up the glass cockpit so we can view a little bit bigger the MFDs.
Yeah, there we go.
That's perfect. Okay, so what we can say right here is here's the position of the moon. Well, it's the same thing, but in a different plane. Here we get a bird's eye view from the top of the North Pole, in a sense. Here is Earth, and here we're getting a side view. So here's the moon. This node here behind it is this node over here, and then ahead of it is this node over here. This is the line of known. So this is when our trajectory, of course right now we are landed, but this green line shows the trajectory we would have if we had launched at the 90 heading.
Right.
So this is exactly the same. So these intersections over here are these two, and what we want to do is we want to time our arrival at the apoapsis at the lunar orbit with when the moon is at one of these intersections, either here or on the next one.
Okay, so basically what we need to do is while we're sitting here on the ground and we're not burning any fuel, we want to warp time forward until the moon, represented here, is closer to this point, or it would also be represented over here if we look in orbit MFD. And exactly how close we want to get will depend on how fast we want our trip out to the moon to be. A typical trip out to the moon is about 3.5 days. And it turns out that it takes the moon, what is it, about 28 days to go around the Earth once?
Yeah, 27.23, I think.
Okay, so real close to 28 days. So that means that half of a trip would be 14 days. So in other words, the moon's here right now. And if we waited 14 days, then the moon would be over here. And that would be past the line of nodes, which is too far. So if we cut it in half again, half of a half is 7 days. So that would be about a 90-degree angle to the line of nodes. If we can kind of, actually there's one thing I can do here on my end that will actually help clarify that. Just give me 1 second. Have a on-screen protractor that we can use to show exactly what these angles look like so we don't just have to guess at them. Let me just roll this around here. Just give me 1 second. Okay, so we're saying that, if we want to arrive at the moon at this point here, then a 3.5 day trip to the moon would be roughly at about that point where the mouse is pointing at. Would you say that's about correct?
Yeah.
So at about a 45-degree angle between the line of nodes and the and where the moon needs to be.
So yeah, that would be a trip that takes about 3.5 days.
So we're just going to kind of warp time forward, get closer to that point. And then there will also be one more thing to mention about the actual position of this sort of sine wave thing we call. I think we're getting pretty close to that point, don't you? Maybe a little bit further.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Probably about here, roughly.
A little bit more.
Okay, let's go forward a little bit farther.
I'm also looking at map MFD and seeing that.
Right. So also,
you can see here is the node, and you can count because it's box 30 degrees. At about there, I think. Yeah.
And the other thing I believe that we want to look at is we want the this line here to be closer to the actual pattern if we were to launch at a 90-degree heading. Right now we're pretty far out of plane.
Yes, this is the next thing that we need to check. So perhaps we would like to see also the next node to see if it's any better at that. The reason for that is because if we are too much out of plane, we are still going to arrive at the moon. But imagine going, instead of traveling in the same direction, we are going from up to down, and the moon is going from side to side. So we're going to have a high encounter velocity. That is all. That is all that it affects. We're still going to get to the moon, but we are going to waste some fuel.
Right. Yeah, that's one of the things that I remember from when we sort of previously talked about this, is that, and I didn't even, wasn't completely aware of this, if you do these off-plane transfers and you arrive at the moon, basically where you have like this cross section, then you're going to have a higher encounter velocity. Whereas if you're more in plane with the moon, then your encounter velocity is reduced. And I believe we can look at that also in a line plane, if I'm not mistaken. If we bring up a line plane and target the moon. I believe this also lets us know how sort of far out of plane we are on this particular date.
Yes. Yes,
And
you can see that we're very misaligned, let's say it. I think we can do better on the next node.
okay, so
But
we would
we
actually
can
go
check.
all the way around,
Probably, yeah.
and that would
But
be
we can make a note of this number, and then check the next node. If that one is worse than this one, we can come back to this with a scenario editor, or simply skip ahead one day.
okay. So what I'm doing right now then is I'm just warping time forward, and I'm watching the relative inclination here. You can also see this in map MFD, but I think you get a little bit more accuracy here if you look at a line plane MFD, and we can see that the relative inclination is 9.12, and now the rate's gone positive. But let me show you what that looks like in map MFD. You can see how the green line and the yellow line are now sort of matched, or at least they're matched as closely as they can be. But it does look like we might be a little bit too far ahead on orbit MFD. What do you think? Or does that still look about 45 degrees to you?
Well, again, I think it's okay, and I'm also checking from here. This is how I'm used to doing it. That's why I don't look at orbit MFD that much. Well, here's the node, and each of these boxes is 30 degrees. So this place, which is about half in the middle of this box, again here, that's exactly 30 degrees. So this line over here is 45, and then perhaps another 5 or 10 degrees. So right now I think we're about 50-55 degrees away from the node, which would take about 4 days to get there.
Okay. So this would be a pretty good time to go then.
Yeah, either now or about in an hour or so. But yeah, we can launch now.
Okay, let's just go ahead and launch now for the sake of time. And what we want to do, instead of spending the 11 or 12 minutes that it takes to get up into orbit, we'll go ahead and use the scenario editor to put the vessel into an orbit as if we took off and just went straight to 90 degrees. So we'll do that by just going to the scenario editor, hitting edit on this vessel, orbital elements, and we'll set it to KM, and then we're just going to put ourselves at 6563. I believe that'll be a 200 kilometer orbit.
6571.1.
6571.1, and a 0 eccentricity.
0.01. It's okay. It's around 200 kilometers. 0.01 is going to be exactly.
Okay, so 6571.01, and then a 0 eccentricity. Actually, do we want the frame to be ecliptic or equatorial?
Don't care, because it's going to keep exactly the same inclination and longitude of anesthetic node.
Got it.
Exactly the same as you have now. So as you can see here on MapMFD, it's as if you got into orbit by launching at a 90-degree heading. The only difference is that in a real launch, you would be farther downrange than what you are from the scenario editor.
Right. Let me close that out. And again, we just did that for the sake of time because it would take, an additional 12 minutes just to ride up through orbit. So this is just a shortcut. Okay, now we are in orbit. So basically, we just took off from KSC. We flew, we got into a nice 200 orbit. And now we want to figure out how to get to the moon. So let's use IMFD to solve that problem. And I'll get you have control of the mouse, so I'll let you go through the interface.
Okay, so we're going to select IMFD. Here it is. And hit the menu button. What we want to use is the course program over here. Okay. And after we hit set the target in the cell program, you press the target button, and we select our target, which is, in this case, it's the moon.
Okay.
But because I'm getting a very slow response from my end, perhaps it would be better if you clicked on the buttons, and I will instruct you what to do.
Okay, I can understand that. The latency, the lag between the
Yeah,
interfaces.
there is a little bit of lag, and it's a little bit confusing from my end. I press the button, and until the response comes, I don't know if I pressed it or not.
Right.
Okay, here we are. Now, what you can see now is the way IMFD works. Instead of TransX, where you have to input the parameters of a burn, and then it's going to tell you how close you're going to be to your target, here you say when you want to leave and when you want to arrive, and it figures out a solution to give you what kind of burn you need to make. So it's in some sense it's the other way around from TransX.
And that's a very important point. Let me just kind of reword that. What we're saying here, when you use TransX, and hopefully if you're familiar with it, because obviously if you've been watching my videos for a long time, I always use it, then you'll know how it works. When you bring up TransX, generally you start by inputting some prograde, and then you do maybe a little bit of plane change, and sometimes you have to do some outward as well. And then you'll also look at the encounter view to see basically what's happening as you input that prograde, how close are you getting to your target. Now, IMFD doesn't do that at all. Instead of putting in prograde and plane change and outward, you put in the target, like the moon, and you put in the destination time, like when do you want to arrive. And then based on when you leave and when you arrive, interplanetary MFD calculates all the necessary plane change, outward, and prograde that's necessary. So you don't use those three variables. It's an important distinction between the two MFDs.
Exactly. So let me say now what we are looking at here. Here's the time to ejection. This is in how many seconds we need to make the burn. Of course, right now IMFD has already figured out the solution, a very expensive one, to get to the moon in 5 days. You can see this is the date that we are leaving, and this is the date of arrival. And this is exactly the same right above it, but it's measured in seconds. Over here and over here. 5 days is 405,000 seconds, and we're supposed to live in about 20 minutes. And this is the delta V the total delta V that IMFD is going to use for this solution.
Wow.
Over here, which is of course it's very expensive.
It's about 4 times higher.
Yeah, and another thing important thing that we can look over here is this, the ejection inclination. So right now, our orbit from this plan, okay, from this expensive plan, we are actually 1°.71 out of plane. So let's go ahead and fix that. The only thing that we need to change is here, the arrival, first, to get a minimum delta V over here, and then we can proceed with the other variables.
Okay, so what we do, and one thing I'll mention here too, is when we adjust the MJD, if this were to say GET instead of MJD, that would be due to the fact that you didn't update your IMFD 5.cfg like we talked about at the beginning of the video. And if you didn't do that, then you could go through IMFD to change from GET to MJD. but hopefully you edited the file. Now, to adjust the MJD, I believe we want to go backwards because this is a 5-day and we don't want that much. We want just more of a like a 3.5 day.
Yeah, I think so too.
Okay, so we'll just start here by in IMFD you navigate around just by going previous or next, and then you can see it moves from one area of the MFD to the next. So we're going to start.
Highlight it. Yeah.
Yeah, it's highlighted and underlined, and that's how you know which one you're on. And then you make the adjustment by clicking either plus or minus. And if the adjustment 1x is not enough, you can go to 10x here or 100x. But we'll start with 1x. And watch the EIN here as I put in a bit of negative time. Oops, I accidentally closed it.
Well,
go ahead.
First, you want to look at the delta V, and then we're going to look at the EIN. But of course, these two should probably coincide. You will get the minimum delta V probably when you are also at zero inclination.
Yes.
In reference to TransX, this is exactly the same as the relative inclination in TransX.
Okay, so as we put in the negative to take away some time, in other words, so we can arrive at the moon sooner, if we watch the delta V that it's going to cost us, you'll notice it's come way down already. But as we continue to put in a bit of negative here to speed up our trip to the moon, which might sound a bit strange because how can we use less fuel if we're speeding up? But anyway, we're looking for a low number here on the delta V and kind of watching that EIN as well. And it looks to me like we're getting really close to the low point because now it's actually
going up again. Yeah.
Delta V is still, the delta V is total is actually going up. So right here at 5.5 or 5.6, this number here, this is where we're at the lowest point. So what do we want to adjust from here?
Now you want to make a finer adjustment by changing the number of seconds over here. So you can press previous to go to the previous variable, which is that one. Hit the adjust button, so because now you're changing 1 second at a time every time you press plus or minus. If you hit the adjust, you're changing 1 minute at a time at 10 times.
Okay.
And if you go to 100, you're changing 1 hour at a time.
For people who are familiar with TransX, I would kind of maybe make this analogy that when we adjust the MJD here, it might be kind of like adjusting things in TransX using the coarse or medium setting. And then as we go to the TIN, we're kind of getting more down to that like ultra hyper area.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a good analogy. It's exactly how it is.
So here at the TIN, the 1x probably won't be sufficient, so we're going to press ADJ to adjust that to 10x. And now we're going to hit minus and see what happens on the delta V and the EIN. And as I hit minus, I can see things are improving still.
This is the number that you're also looking, so I think you need plus.
Okay, actually, we're not looking at the total then, we're just looking at the DV?
No, we're looking at the delta V we need to eject to the moon.
Okay, so let's go the other way with it then. Let's go plus, and we're watching the DV, and it's going down. So let me kind of hold down plus here for a second. And we can see that's improving. It looks like right there at 185 was the lowest, so let's go back a bit. That's what I saw as the lowest. There was 3.185.
Okay. Now, the other thing that we have the lowest right now, the lowest delta V setting for this date of arrival. What we can also adjust is the time of ejection, because it was already preset for the plan that IMFD previously had, which was a very expensive plan. You remember 13 kilometers per second.
Right.
So we can go right ahead to, you don't have to change the date, of course, just a few seconds on the time of ejection. And you can also zoom in to see the orbit of the spacecraft around Earth right now. So I'm going to hit page for that.
Okay.
and you can use this, but it would be better if you pressed because I'm still getting some lag over here. You can zoom in with or zoom out with these two buttons.
Okay, so let's zoom in about that far.
Yeah, that's great. And now you can change. Now you can see that this line tells you exactly when you are going to meet where is the arrival at the moon. This straight line all the way up ahead, and you can see that we're slightly past this straight line over here. So if you take out a few seconds, we should get a better delta V setting.
Okay, so basically we're doing the burn not quite at what would you call it, maybe periapsis at Earth. We're kind of getting a bit on the we're adding in basically a bit of outward.
Yeah.
In order to get to that. So what we'll do here then, and by the way, we got to this zoom in setting by pressing the PG button, so I need to press PG to go back a page. Now I'll press NXT until it wraps around over here to TEJ, and we're kind of basically wanting to straighten this blue line out, move it sort of counterclockwise, so that's going to be minus. And as we do that...
Where our guide is going to be here, this the delta V.
Right. And as we do that, the delta V should come down. So let me see if that happened. I don't recall what the previous delta V was.
It was around 3180, but you can see over here that our injection, our relative inclination, I'll just call it like that, is a little bit high, 0.22. So we may have to adjust the time to injection a little bit more. Basically, we're playing around with these two variables,
right,
until we get a minimum delta V over here. And usually, you get a minimum delta V, and you also get a zero in a relative inclination to your orbit.
And it is worth pointing out too that once you get just a basic setup here, you don't have to really tweak these variables, all the way down to this point. You could burn at this point and go. This is just to show the most efficient, the very best way to get out. So the other variable...
You could even use the plan that was at the start with 13 kilometers per second as a delta V. You would still get to the moon.
It would be a terrible way to get there. You'd waste a bunch of fuel.
Yeah.
And depending on which vessel you use, you might not even have enough fuel. But let's go previous, actually next, I guess, is the quicker way over to TIN. And we're wanting to adjust this again to find that lower delta V. So we're kind of going back and forth between a couple of variables here, looking for lowest delta V. And that's coming down. You can see we're at 3.3, 3.2. And still coming down. And there it bottomed out. So let's go back to 3.136. That's the lowest one. Now I'm assuming that we're going to want to go back to TEJ.
Yeah, you can also go to the adjustment setting of 1 now and finally tune this to 0, but we can leave it like this. I mean, it's not so important. So now you go to this variable again, set the adjustment setting to 1, and see when you get the absolute minimum of the delta V.
Okay, so we're going to go back to TEJ and add in a little bit more plus. Let me see if that's going up or down. That's going up, so let's go backwards, go minus. Okay, so if I go back a little bit, it's going up. If I go forward, let me see if I can... Yeah, if I go forward, it's going up. So it looks to me like it's already at that lowest point right there at 3 point...
Right now, 3.13637, something like that. Is the lowest point. Okay, and that's it. As you play around with these two variables over here, the MJD is for a more a broader adjustment, and then for finer adjustment, the TEJ for the time to ejection over here and the time to intercept over here. And you look at the delta V for when you get a minimum delta V for the plan that you have chosen. And right now we're ready. All you have to do is hit once again the page button, and then the burn vector, and the IMFD is going to, you can set an auto burn.
Okay,
so
well
we
that's
perform the burn for you.
okay. I think that's a really good overview, and we're coming up on 30 minutes here, so let's go ahead and kind of pause here. And when we come back in the next video, we'll do a quick recap of everything that we did here in the setup of IMFD, and then we'll kind of show how to actually do the burn to get out to the moon. So if you like this part of the video, please hit the like button and leave a comment down below just to kind of say thanks to Dimitri for taking the time to help us out. And I'll put a link to his YouTube channel in the description down below. Be sure to check that out as well. And just a way of showing a bit of appreciation for him taking the time to do this for us. And I will see you in the next video. Default like it is here, change that to 0. Now for me, I'm just going to leave it like it is because this is a default file that I've got extra. But the one in my config file, I'll show you here. If I double click on this one, you can see that I've already made that change to my date format. It's set to 0. So we just wanted to make that point. It's something you can change inside of IMFD itself, but if you do that, it is not persistent. So every time you start IMFD, you would actually have to go into the configuration of IMFD and change it from GET format to MJD, whereas if you set it in the config file, it will be set that way all the time. So I'm just starting a basic scenario here at KSC, and one of the first things we're going to look at, I think, is just a simple trip out to the moon. Getting to the moon takes a couple days, so the time warps really fast, and it's just a good place to start. So Dimitri, is there really anything that we want to look at while we're on the ground? Do we need to do any planning while we're on the ground?
Well, right now, unless we want to do a direct ascent to the moon, a direct ascent and burn to the moon, there is really not much that we can do right here. It's the same as Transx. We have to figure out when to launch at the 90 heading, and then make enough plane David learn about IMFD, and of course you too.
That's right. So actually, without just a lot of talk, let's just kind of jump right into it. You'll notice that I have here on my screen a configuration file for IMFD, and you'll find this if you go into your orbiter directory and go into config and scroll down. There are two files, and I want to make just a brief mention of this. You may have imfd.cfg, and you'll have imfd5.cfg like I have here. imfd.cfg is actually part of BaseSync, and imfd5.cfg is actually part of the IMFD MFD itself. So this is actually the one you want to look at, is imfd5.cfg. And there's just one thing that we want to kind of mention here. So I'll actually let Dimitri introduce that here, what we want to make sure we change in this file.
Well, because it's going to be necessary to have the date format in IMFD in MJD instead of hours, minutes, seconds, which is GET, it would be better to go ahead and change that entry over here, the date format, and change it to 0, which is MJD.
So basically, just open that file, come down to date format, and this will be set to 1 by default. Okay, welcome to another Orbiter 2010 video. And in this video, we're going to start learning how to use IMFD. Very excited about that because I have many flights that I think I could improve myself if I could learn how to use this MFD. Now you'll notice here, if you look on the screen, that you can see that I have a sort of a co-pilot with me here today. The other image that you see is Dimitri. I've talked about Dimitri in many of my videos. He's helped me so many times in the last year. So just quickly, Dimitri, if you want to go ahead and introduce yourself and say hi.
Okay, hi everyone, I'm Dimitri. I'm a fellow Orbinat. You may know me as Digatsulis in Orbiter Forum. And I'm here to help